Welcome to Pragim Technologies. I am Venkat. This is part 21 of ASP.NET video series. In this session, we'll learn about retrieving the selected item text, value, and index of an ASP.NET drop-down list. Before continuing with this session, I strongly recommend to watch parts 16, 17, and 18 of this video series. With that, let's jump into a demo. Here I have a very simple ASP.NET web application project. Let's drag and drop a drop-down list control onto the web form. Now we know that a drop-down list is a collection of list item objects, and there are several different ways to add list items to the drop-down list. We can do that at the design time using the HTML source, or we can programmatically add list item objects in the code behind file, or we can load the items from the database table and then add them to the drop-down list, or you can bind the drop-down list to an XML file. And we have seen these different ways of adding list item objects in the previous sessions of this video series. For the purposes of this demo, we will add the list item objects at the design time using the HTML source. Now we know that a drop-down list is a collection of list item objects, so let's add a list item. And list item has got a text and a value property. So text is equal to, let's say we want to display the list of continents in this drop-down list. So Asia is the text of the continent, and let's say the value that gets stored against this continent is 1. Okay, similarly we have other continents, so let's add them. Just to save some time in typing, I have them already typed. Let's copy paste them. Okay, so we have several continents that gets displayed within this drop-down list: Asia, Europe, Africa. Along with these continents, I have another list item objects which says, the text is select continent and the value is -1. Basically, this is like a prompt to the user to select the continent. So when we run this project now, as you might expect, select continent is what is displayed in the drop-down list. Okay, and then user can select his continent. Now, once the user selects his continent and then clicks submit button, now I want to be able to retrieve the text and value properties of this selected item. Okay, obviously we know that drop-down list is a collection of list item objects, so each list item has got the text and value properties. So whenever a user makes a selection within the drop-down list, I want to retrieve the text and value properties and display them. That's one thing. Another thing, if you look at this, it's a collection of these drop-down list is a collection of these list item objects, and every list item object has got an index within the drop-down list. So the index of the first list item is 0, the second list item is 1, and it goes on 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. Okay, so every selection that you make in a drop-down list, you will have a text, a value, and an index, and we want to kind of retrieve those values when the user selects a list item in the drop-down list and when he submits the web form. Okay, let's see how to do that. And obviously to do that we need a button control. So let's drag and drop a button control onto the web form. And once we double click, the event handler gets generated. So when I click the button, I want to be in a position to retrieve the selected item's text, value, and the index. Okay, and how do we do that? There are several properties that we can make use of. For example, to retrieve the text of the selected item, I can simply say dropdownlist1.selecteditem.text, and look at the names of these properties. They are very meaningful. In dropdown list 1, that's the ID of the dropdown list. Selected item, whatever the user has selected, that items give me the text property. And similarly, if you want the value, you can just say selected item.value. Okay, another simple way to get the selected item's value is to simply use dropdownlist1.selectedValue property. And to get the index, you can simply say dropdownlist1.selectedIndex, and it's so simple. So let's try to do that. And but the first thing that I want to do is, if the user hasn't selected anything, if he didn't make a selection at all, if it is defaulting to select continent. So if he hasn't selected any continent, then I want to show a message to the user, telling him that he needs to make a selection. So how do we do that? If you look at the source for this drop-down list, the value for the first list item is -1. So, and we know that to retrieve the selected value, you can directly say dropdown list1.selectedValue. So if the dropdown list 1's selected value is -1, then we know that he didn't make a selection. Okay, so that's how we can check that. So if dropdown list 1 dot selected value is equal to -1, then we know for sure he didn't make a selection at all, in which case we will write a message saying please select a continent. Okay, now if the selection is not -1, if the selected value is not -1, then we know for sure he has selected some continent from that drop down list, in which case we want to retrieve the text value and the index properties. And to do that, so response.write, we have drop down list 1 dot I want the selected item text, so I can simply say text, and then let's use an HTML break here so that the output comes in separate lines. So if you want the value, then you use the value property, and if you want the index, you simply say dot selected index. It's as simple as that. So now let's go ahead and run this. Obviously, when the page renders, it displays all the items within the browser, within the drop-down list. And look at this, if I don't make a selection and if I try to click this button, obviously selected value will be -1. So you see that message, please select a continent. On the other hand, if I go ahead and select, let's say, Asia, the first continent in the list, and click the button, look at that, the text is Asia, and the value is 1, and the index is also 1. So if I actually flip to the HTML, if you look at Asia, text is Asia, value is 1, and the index is 1, because index 0 is taken by the first list item. Okay, so it's so simple to retrieve the selection from a drop-down list. Now let's say, whenever the page loads, I want to default the selection to some continent, for example, Asia. Okay, so how do we do that? We can use the selected value or selected index properties. If you look at the statement here, the selected index and selected value properties of the drop-down list can also be used to have a list item selected in the drop-down list. So by default, if you want a list item to be selected, there are actually two ways to do that. One is, within the HTML, you can actually specify, okay, if you want, let's say, Asia to be selected by default, you can specify selected is equal to true here, and that gets selected when the page actually loads. But if you want to do that programmatically in the code behind file, then you can use one of the two properties, selected index or selected value. If you look at Asia, the index of this one is 1. Okay, and the value is also 1. So you can either use, when the page loads, what I want to do is drop down list 1 dot selected index. Index is 1 and selected index is an integer property, so we need to set that as an integer. Now obviously, if we run this, instead of defaulting to please select, Asia will be selected because its index is 1. Okay, along the same lines, you can also use selected value property. But then if you look at the selected value property, it's a string property. So obviously you need to set this value as a string. So once you pass it as a string, the output will be exactly similar, except that we are using selected value property to set the default selection. Okay, now whenever you set the default programmatically in the code, one very important thing to keep in mind is you will have to do that in a condition. You have to do that only when the page loads for the first time. You don't want to be doing that in the post back, during the post back. You'll just understand that problem in a bit. Let me run this. Okay, once we run this, obviously it will load all the items and then it defaults to Asia. Now let's say I selected South America and then I clicked this button. Look at this, it is showing my selection as Asia, and then the selected value is 1, index is also 1. Why is it doing that? Let me select North America. I click this button, look at that. It is still showing as Asia, because when you click this button, what happens? The web form gets posted back to the server. And we have spoken about page lifecycle, web form lifecycle in the previous sessions of this video series. So what happens when the request is sent back to the server? A new instance of this web form gets created, a new instance of the drop down list gets created, all the items are added to the drop down list. And then since we you know after that, the page lifecycle events get started. During the page load events happen before the button click event. So during the page load event, what's happening? It's selecting. You are setting the selected value to 1, which means you're telling, okay, set the selection to Asia. Okay, and then the button click event happens after the page load event. So in the button click event, you are retrieving that selected value. Okay, so that's why anytime you do this, you set a default value within the drop down list. You do that in if not is post back conditional block, because you want to do that only during the initial page load, when the page first loads. After that, when the user changes the selection post the page back, you don't want to be defaulting that again to the default value. Okay, so to correct this problem, all we have to do is wrap this inside if not is post back. I struggled with this when I was initially learning ASP.NET. I didn't properly understand the page lifecycle of an ASP.NET web form, and I was struggling to figure out why the hell is it not remembering its state, because page view state restoration happens in page initialization event, which happens before page load. So at that point, it remembers the selection. The view state gets loaded onto the drop down list. But in the page load, we are overriding that programmatically. Okay, and then button click event happens, because of which the value will be defaulted to Asia back. Okay, so now if we run this, it should work as expected. The first time when the page loads, Asia will be defaulted. Upon a post back, it remembers your selection. So it defaulted to Asia. If I select North America, I click this button, look at that, it correctly remembers that. On this slide, you can find resources for ASP.NET, C#, and SQL Server interview questions. That's it for today. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.